Ethan Rivers's fingers danced across the keyboard, lines of code appearing on his screen in a blur of motion. The soft light of the monitor illuminated his face in the otherwise dim room, casting long shadows in the quiet office. At 39, he wore the focused look of a man who had found his true calling, both as a successful software engineer and, at least in theory, as a husband and father. But the quiet was broken by a light knock on the door. He turned in his chair to see his wife, Sophia, leaning against the doorframe. At 35, she carried herself with effortless elegance, her business outfit perfectly pressed despite the late hour. "Hey," she said, offering a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just wanted to let you know I'm heading to bed." "Early flight tomorrow," Ethan nodded absently, his eyes lingering on her face, but his mind already drifting back to the problem at hand. "Another conference?" "Yeah," Sophia replied, her tone flat. "Big pitch in New York. I'll be back by Friday." Her eyes flicked to the mess of empty coffee mugs scattered across his desk, and she sighed, the faintest edge of concern in her voice. "Don't stay up too late, okay?" "I won't," he promised, though his thoughts were already returning to his code. "Good luck with the pitch." As she turned to leave, Ethan felt that familiar, hollow ache deep in his chest. These quick exchanges, these brief moments in doorways, had become the routine of their marriage. It had been 12 years, but the connection that once seemed so strong now felt like a threadbare rope. He couldn't quite recall when it had started, but somewhere along the way, their lives had slowly drifted in opposite directions. Turning back to his screen, he hovered his fingers over the keys, unwilling to confront the emptiness that gnawed at him. The house settled into its usual quiet, broken only by the hum of the computer and the distant ticking of a clock. This was his space, his sanctuary. The stillness, the focus, the satisfaction of a job well done. It was what had carried him to success in Silicon Valley and allowed him to build the life he had promised his family. But even in his moment of accomplishment, his eyes wandered to the framed photograph on his desk, a shot from their trip to Hawaii 5 years ago. Sophia was laughing, building a sandcastle with their daughter while their son toddled toward the camera, arms flailing with childlike enthusiasm. Ethan's throat tightened. That had been the last time they had all laughed like that, truly together. He shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside and trying to focus on the task at hand. This was just a busy period, he told himself. Once Sophia's project was over, things would calm down. They'd have time for each other again, for the kids. Everything would return to normal. The next morning, Ethan woke up to find the bed cold and empty, a hastily scribbled note left on Sophia's pillow. "Didn't want to wake you. See you Friday, lovey." He sighed, rubbing his eyes. Another week of solo parenting stretched out before him, the weight of it already heavy on his shoulders as he shuffled through the routine of getting the kids ready for school. The uneasy feeling in his stomach wouldn't fade. In the kitchen, Lily, his 8-year-old, carefully packed her backpack while Leo, their 5-year-old, zoomed around, making spaceship noises. "Daddy," Lily called, her brow furrowed in concentration as she zipped up her bag. "When's Mom coming home?" Ethan forced a smile. "Friday, sweetheart." Just like last time, Lily nodded, but her shoulders sagged ever so slightly. "Okay," she murmured, then hesitated. "She promised she'd help me with my science project this weekend." Ethan ruffled her hair, trying to mask the sting of guilt he felt. "I can help you with that," he said, his voice light, though his mind was elsewhere. "What's the project about?" As Lily eagerly launched into an explanation about photosynthesis, a mix of pride and sadness washed over him. His little girl was growing up so fast, and Sophia was missing so much of it. He mentally added, "Talk to Sophia about cutting back on travel," to his to-do list. The week dragged on in a blur of work deadlines, school pickups, and bedtime stories. By Friday evening, Ethan found himself pacing in the living room, staring at the door, waiting for the sound of Sophia's key in the lock. When she finally walked through the door, wheeling her suitcase behind her, he couldn't help but notice how drained she looked. "Hey," he said, moving to take her bag. How was the trip? Sophia gave him a tired, half-hearted smile. Exhausting, but successful. We landed the account, that's great, Ethan replied, searching her face for any hint of excitement, any spark of the woman he'd fallen in love with. But all he saw was fatigue, and something else, something distant, as if she were already mentally checked out. I'm beat, she said, stifling a yawn. Mind if I grab a quick shower before dinner? Of course, Ethan said, swallowing the disappointment that rose in his throat. Take your time. As she disappeared upstairs, he busied himself reheating the lasagna he had prepared. He set the table, poured 2 glasses of wine, and waited. And waited. Nearly an hour passed before she finally came back downstairs, her hair damp and tousled. She had changed into sweatpants and one of his old t-shirts, an outfit that used to make his heart race. Now, it just highlighted how small and fragile she seemed. Sorry, she murmured, sliding into her chair. I guess I dozed off for a bit. Ethan pushed down the flicker of irritation that rose in his chest. It's fine. You must be exhausted. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the clink of their forks against the plates the only sound in the room. Ethan cleared his throat. So, tell me about the trip. How did the pitch go? Sophia launched into a detailed account of her presentation, her voice monotone, her words as mechanical as the motions of her life. Sophia's eyes lit up as she talked about the client's reaction, her voice suddenly brighter, more animated. Ethan nodded along, keeping up the charade of interest, but something about her enthusiasm didn't sit right with him. It felt forced, almost rehearsed, as if she were trying too hard to convince him, or herself. And then Cameron swooped in with the numbers. Sophia continued, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. And that sealed the deal. Ethan's fork halted midair. Cameron? He asked, trying to mask the slight edge in his voice. Is he new on your team? No, Sophia answered, her cheeks flushing slightly. He's been our sales director for about a year now. I'm sure I've mentioned him before, had she? Ethan's mind scrambled for any memory of this, Cameron, but he came up blank. He forced a smile, though it felt tight on his face. Right, of course. Well, it sounds like you two make a great team. Sophia didn't answer right away, her eyes darting away, focusing on her plate as if it held the answers. Yeah, she muttered, almost to herself. We work well together. The conversation stumbled to a halt, and an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Ethan watched her carefully, the subtle shifts in her demeanor catching his attention. She was avoiding his gaze, her hand trembling ever so slightly as she reached for her wine glass. It was as if the woman sitting across from him wasn't the same one he'd known for over a decade. She was a stranger now, a stranger he was living with. Sophia, he said softly, his voice quieter than usual, as he reached across the table to touch her hand. Is everything okay? She jerked back as if his touch had burned her, her eyes wide with surprise. What? She asked, her voice edged with irritation. Yes, of course. I'm just tired, that's all. Ethan's chest tightened, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. A sickening chill wrapped around his heart. You know, he said carefully, you can talk to me about anything, right? If something's bothering you, or if work is too much. I said I'm fine, Ethan, Sophia snapped, her voice suddenly sharp and colder than he'd ever heard it. Her eyes hardened, but she quickly took a deep breath and composed herself, the mask of calm settling back into place. I'm sorry, she added, her tone softer now. It's just been a long week. I think I'm going to turn in early, if that's okay. Before he could respond, she was already rising from the table, moving swiftly toward the stairs. Ethan watched her retreat, the weight of his unease pressing down on him, gnawing at his insides. Something was wrong, he could feel it in his bones. And he was determined to find out what it was. The next morning, Ethan woke early, his mind swirling with a restless, anxious energy. He got out of bed quietly, careful not to disturb Sophia or the kids, and padded downstairs to start a pot of coffee. His eyes fell on the laundry basket in the corner of the kitchen, and something about it caught his attention. Sophia's suitcase was still there, lying abandoned beside the basket, its contents barely touched. Without thinking, Ethan found himself rifling through the dirty clothes. His hand brushed against something silky, Sophia's blouse, the one she always wore for important meetings. It was soft and familiar, but something was off. As he lifted it from the pile, a faint, unfamiliar odor caught his nose. It wasn't Sophia's perfume, it was something musky, something masculine. His heart skipped, then pounded harder in his chest. He examined the blouse more closely, his hands trembling as he noticed the small stain near the collar. White. Crusty. His stomach twisted in horror as the reality of what he was looking at hit him like a physical blow. No, he thought, shaking his head in denial. There had to be another explanation. Sophia would never. But even as he tried to convince himself, Ethan knew, deep down, what he was seeing. The late nights, the distance, the mysterious Cameron. It all clicked into place, horribly, painfully clear. For a long moment, he stood frozen in the kitchen, the stained blouse gripped tightly in his trembling hands. Part of him wanted to storm upstairs, to confront Sophia with the proof, to demand answers. But the rational, methodical side of his brain, the side that made him an excellent software engineer, held him back. He couldn't confront her without the truth, without hard, undeniable evidence. He needed proof. With shaking hands, he carefully folded the blouse and placed it in a plastic bag, his mind spinning faster than he could keep up with. He scribbled down the address of a discreet testing lab he'd once used for a work project, then stashed the bag in his briefcase. As he heard the faint stirrings of movement upstairs, Ethan quickly tidied up the kitchen, his mind racing with the terrible realization. He'd dropped the blouse off at the lab on his way to work in a couple of days. He'd have his answer. And then he would decide what to do next. The next few days dragged on in a blur of anxious waiting. Ethan moved through his days in a mechanical haze, work, family dinners, bedtime stories, each moment heavy with the weight of his suspicions. He watched Sophia closely, his gaze tracking her every move, searching for any sign of guilt or deception. But she gave no indication that she noticed the scrutiny. On Tuesday evening, as Ethan helped Lily with her homework, his phone buzzed with an email notification. His heart leapt into his throat as he saw the sender, Discrete Testing Services. With trembling fingers, he opened the message. The results were cold, clinical, and devastating. The substance on the blouse was indeed bodily fluid, and it contained traces of a particularly virulent strain of syphilis. Ethan felt the room spin, his daughter's voice fading into background noise as the implications hit him full force. Sophia hadn't just betrayed him, she had potentially exposed him to a life-threatening disease. "Daddy, are you okay?" Lily's worried voice pierced through the fog of shock and anger. Ethan blinked, forcing himself to focus on his daughter's concerned face. He forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired. Why don't you finish up that last problem on your own? I think you've got the hang of it now," Ethan said, watching Lily bend over her notebook, her concentration fully on her work. He excused himself and retreated to his home office, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. Leaning against the door, he struggled to steady his breath. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: hurt, betrayal, rage, fear. What now? The question echoed relentlessly in his head, demanding an answer. Should he confront Sophia right away? Kick her out, file for divorce? Or should he take a step back, gather more evidence before making a decision? As the initial shock of the discovery began to wear off, Ethan's analytical mind slowly reasserted itself. He needed more information, more facts before making any moves. And, above all, he needed to protect himself and his children from whatever fallout Sophia's reckless behavior might bring. Taking a deep breath, he moved toward his computer and began researching. He searched for symptoms of syphilis, treatment options, and long-term prognosis. The more he read, the colder his fury grew. Sophia hadn't just violated their marriage vows, she had endangered his life. As Ethan delved deeper into his research, a plan began to form in his mind. He wouldn't confront her. Not yet. He needed to dig deeper, uncover the full scope of her deception. When he had all the evidence, when he knew everything, then he would act. The sound of the front door opening jolted him from his thoughts. He quickly closed the tabs on his browser, smoothing his shirt as he stood up. Stepping out of his office, he found Sophia in the entryway, already kicking off her heels. "Hey," she said, offering him a tired, almost apologetic smile. "Sorry I'm late." Last-minute client called. Ethan studied her closely, searching her face for any hint of guilt or deception. But all he found was that same distracted, almost detached expression she'd been wearing for months. "No problem," he replied, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "There's leftover lasagna in the fridge if you're hungry." Sophia nodded absently, already heading for the stairs. "Thanks, but I think I'll just turn in." It's been a long day. As she disappeared up the stairs, Ethan felt a cold surge of determination settle over him. He would get to the truth, no matter what it took. And when he did, Sophia would learn just how big of a mistake it had been to betray Ethan Rivers. Later that night, Ethan sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen casting long shadows across his face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his hands trembling slightly as he steeled himself for what he was about to do. The house was silent. Sophia had left for another business trip that morning, and the kids were asleep upstairs. Ethan took a deep breath, then began typing. Years of experience in tech had honed his skills, and he easily bypassed Sophia's passwords and logged into her personal cloud storage. His heart raced as he navigated through her files. Part of him hoped he wouldn't find anything, that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But then, he saw it. A folder labeled NYC Trip Videos. Ethan hesitated, his finger poised over the mouse. Did he really want to see what was inside? Could he handle it? But the image of the stained blouse flashed through his mind, too clear, too vivid. His resolve hardened. He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful. He double-clicked. The folder opened, revealing a series of video files, each labeled with dates. With shaking hands, Ethan clicked on the most recent one. The video began to play. Ethan's world shattered. There, on the screen, was Sophia, his wife of 12 years, the mother of his children, locked in an embrace with another man. He recognized him instantly, Cameron Shaw, the 38-year-old sales director Sophia had mentioned so casually. Ethan slammed the laptop shut, unable to stomach another second of the betrayal. He stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before he emptied his stomach, retching and sobbing uncontrollably. The reality he had feared was now confirmed in the most brutal way possible. When he finally managed to regain some composure, Ethan splashed cold water on his face, his reflection in the mirror almost unrecognizable. The man staring back at him was a stranger, pale, hollow-eyed, with a coldness in his gaze that felt foreign. In that moment, something inside him hardened. The shock, the hurt, the disbelief, all of it began to crystallize into something darker, colder, rage. Ethan returned to his computer, forcing himself to watch more of the videos. Each one felt like a dagger to his heart, but he made himself catalog every detail, every betrayal. These weren't isolated incidents. The videos spanned months, maybe years. Different cities, hotel rooms, even their own home when Ethan was away on business. The sun was beginning to rise by the time Ethan stepped away from the computer. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but his mind was clear. He knew what he had to do. Over the next few days, Ethan set his plan in motion. The first step, create emotional distance between himself and Sophia. When she returned from a trip, he greeted her with cold indifference. "Hey," she said, wheeling her suitcase into the foyer. How were things while I was gone? Ethan barely glanced up from his laptop. Fine, Sophia paused, confusion flashing across her face. Is everything okay? Ethan finally met her gaze, his eyes hard. Why wouldn't it be? I don't know, she said, her voice faltering slightly. You just seem off. Ethan didn't flinch. I'm fine, Sophia. Just busy with work. How was your trip? Sophia shifted uncomfortably, clearly thrown by his aloofness. Productive, she replied quickly. I'm going to go unpack. As she hurried upstairs, Ethan allowed himself a small, satisfied grin. Let her wonder. Let her worry. It was the least she deserved. For the next few weeks, Ethan kept up the cold treatment. He spoke to Sophia only when necessary, avoiding any physical contact, throwing himself deeper into work and caring for the kids. Sophia, caught up in the whirlwind of her affair and her own guilt, barely seemed to notice the change in Ethan at first. The shift in his behavior was subtle at first, like a slow chill creeping into the house. But over time, as Ethan withdrew further, it began to have its effect. One evening, as Ethan was putting the kids to bed, Lily looked up at him with worried eyes. Daddy, are you and Mommy fighting? She asked softly, her small voice thick with concern. Ethan's heart clenched. He sat down on the edge of her bed, brushing her hair back from her forehead, trying to hide the turmoil that had overtaken him. No, sweetheart, he said, forcing a smile. Why do you ask? Lily bit her lip, her brow furrowed with worry. You don't talk to each other anymore. And Mommy looks sad. All the time. Ethan's smile faltered, and a fresh wave of anger washed over him. He swallowed hard, his voice gentle but firm. Grown-up relationships can be complicated sometimes, Lily, he said. But I want you to know that no matter what happens between me and Mommy, we both love you and Leo very, very much. Okay. Lily nodded, but her eyes remained doubtful, the concern still evident on her small face. As Ethan turned off her light and quietly closed her door, he felt the familiar, suffocating knot in his stomach. How dare Sophia do this to their children? How dare she put them through this mess? Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's cold demeanor started to break Sophia. She grew increasingly agitated, desperate for his attention. Her attempts to reach him, small, seemingly innocent gestures, were met with indifference. It only drove her further into a corner. One night, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Sophia finally snapped. Ethan, what the hell is going on with you? She demanded, slamming a plate down on the counter, her voice tight with frustration. You've barely said 2 words to me in weeks. Ethan turned slowly, his expression impassive, as if the woman in front of him no longer had the power to affect him. I wasn't aware I had to entertain you, he replied flatly, his tone almost bored. Don't you have work to keep you busy? Or perhaps other distractions? Sophia's face paled at the insinuation. Her lips parted as if to respond, but she couldn't find the words. What's that supposed to mean? She whispered, her voice trembling with confusion. Nothing, Ethan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Just wondering how you managed to juggle it all, work, family, your extracurricular activities. Sophia recoiled as if slapped. She took a step back, her hand gripping the edge of the counter for support. But before she could speak, Ethan cut her off. Save it, Sophia. I know everything. Sophia froze. No. What? Her voice was barely audible, a mix of fear and disbelief. Ethan laughed, the sound cold and hard, devoid of humor. It echoed through the kitchen like a death sentence. The affair, the disease, all of it. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to care. He'd reached a point where her tears only felt like an insult. I can explain, Sophia stammered, her voice breaking. Explain. Ethan's voice was quiet but dangerous, like the calm before a storm. Explain how you've been spending time with your coworker for months, maybe years. Explain how you brought a potentially fatal STD into our home, risking not just my health but our children's as well. Please, Sophia. I'm all ears. Sophia's tears spilled over, her face crumpling as she took a step forward, her hands outstretched. I'm sorry, Ethan. I never meant for this to go this far. I was lonely, you were always so distant. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his voice growing hard. Don't you dare try to blame this on me, he snarled. I have been nothing but faithful, nothing but supportive of your career, and this is how you repay me. Her sobs grew louder. I'm so sorry, Ethan. It was a mistake. A huge mistake. Please, can we work this out? For the kids. I'll do anything. Ethan stared at her, disgust rising in his chest. The kids, he said, his voice icy. Now you care about the kids. Where was that concern when you were spending time with Cameron and risking their future? When you brought that disease into our home? I think you should sleep in the guest room tonight. Sophia's breath hitched as the words sank in. She staggered back, her sobs racking her body. Without another word, she fled the room, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her guilt. Ethan stood there, unmoving, as the door slammed behind her. A mix of emotions washed over him, rage, hurt, betrayal, but also a grim satisfaction. The reckoning had begun. The next morning, Ethan woke early, his mind already racing. He had an appointment to keep, his video call with Jared Thompson, the ruthless divorce attorney known for dismantling his clients' spouses with surgical precision. As Ethan logged into the call, he was met by the lawyer's cold, calculating gaze. Jared's reputation was evident in the sharpness of his eyes and the tightness of his lips. Mr. Rivers, Jared said in a clipped, professional tone. I understand you're seeking a divorce under difficult circumstances. Ethan nodded, his jaw set. That's correct. My wife has been unfaithful, and worse, she's contracted a potentially fatal STD that she's hidden from me. Jared's eyebrows rose slightly, but his demeanor remained unchanged. I see. And I assume you have evidence to support these claims? Extensive evidence, Ethan confirmed, his voice cold. Videos, emails, medical test results. I've documented everything. A small, predatory smile curved Jared's lips. Excellent. That will give us a significant advantage in court. Now, Mr. Rivers, what exactly are your goals for this divorce? Ethan leaned forward, his eyes steely. I want to protect my children and myself. I want full custody, and I want Sophia to walk away with nothing. She made her choice when she decided to betray our family. Jared nodded approvingly, his tone clipped. With the evidence you've gathered, those goals are certainly achievable. However, I must advise you to keep your wife's illness under wraps for now. If it becomes public knowledge before the divorce is finalized, it could complicate matters. Understood, Ethan replied, his voice firm. What's our next step? Gather more evidence, Jared said, the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. The more we have, the stronger our case will be. I'd also recommend hiring a private investigator to follow your wife on her business trips. It could provide valuable leverage. As the call ended, Ethan felt a deep, almost mechanical determination settle over him. He had a plan now, a path forward. Sophia had dug her own grave, and now she would lie in it. Over the next few weeks, Ethan threw himself into building his case. He hired Evan Larkin, a discreet but thorough private investigator, to follow Sophia on her trips. The reports Evan sent back were damning. Not only was Sophia continuing her affair with Cameron, but they were using company resources to fund their trysts, racking up hotel bills, charging meals to the company card. One evening, as Ethan was reviewing the latest report, his phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Working late tonight. Don't wait up. Ethan's lip curled in disgust. He knew exactly what kind of work she was doing. He fired off a quick response, his fingers tight with anger. Fine. The kids miss you. It was a low blow, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Let her feel some guilt for once. As the weeks passed, Ethan noticed subtle changes in Sophia's health. She complained of fatigue, her eyes hollow and shadowed, her once vibrant complexion now dull and drained. But still, she refused to seek medical help, brushing it off as stress from work. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sick sense of justice. What she had done to him, to their family, was coming back to haunt her. One morning, as Sophia was rushing out the door for another business trip, Ethan couldn't help but make a comment. "You're looking a bit pale, Sophia," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "Maybe you should see a doctor." Sophia paused with her hand on the doorknob, clearly taken aback by the remark. "I'm fine, Ethan," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Ethan shrugged, as if indifferent, but his eyes held something darker. "If you say so. But, you know, some illnesses can be pretty serious if left untreated. Wouldn't want anything to happen to you." A flicker of suspicion crossed Sophia's face as she turned to look at him, her brow furrowing. "What are you implying?" Ethan met her gaze evenly, his expression as neutral as ever. "Nothing at all," he said smoothly. "Just concern for your health. Have a safe trip." Sophia didn't reply, but the silence that followed felt heavy, suffocating. She slammed the door behind her as she left, and for a moment, Ethan allowed himself a small, grim smile. Let her worry. Let her wonder just how much he knew. The power, for once, was in his hands. A few days later, as Ethan sat at his desk reviewing some emails, his phone buzzed. It was Evan Larkin, the private investigator. "Mr. Rivers," Evan's gruff voice came through the line. "I've got some interesting information for you." Ethan's pulse quickened, his posture straightening in anticipation. "Go on." Evan paused for a moment, as if preparing to drop a bomb. "Your wife and Mr. Shaw aren't just using company resources for their little rendezvous," he said, his voice low. "I've uncovered evidence of some pretty serious corporate fraud. They've been siphoning off funds, manipulating expense reports. It's big, Mr. Rivers. Real big." A slow, cold smile spread across Ethan's face as the information hit him like a punch to the gut. This was exactly what he needed: leverage. Not just against Sophia, but against Cameron as well. Something that would destroy both of them, professionally and personally. "Send me everything you have," Ethan said, his voice sharp and controlled. "And keep digging. I want to know every detail of their little operation." As he hung up the phone, a dark sense of triumph surged through him. He had them now. Every lie, every betrayal, every shady deal, he had the power to bring it all crashing down. That evening, as Ethan was helping Leo with his homework, the sound of the front door opening startled him. Sophia burst through, looking pale and shaky. Her skin was damp with sweat, and her movements seemed slow and unsteady. "Mommy!" Leo cried, rushing toward her. "Are you okay?" Sophia forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just a little under the weather. Why don't you go play in your room for a bit? Mommy needs to talk to Daddy." Leo scampered off, still looking worried. As soon as the door to his room closed, Sophia turned to face Ethan, her hands trembling. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice hoarse. Ethan raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting for her to speak. Sophia sank onto the couch, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "I went to the doctor today," she said, her voice breaking. "He says I might have contracted a serious illness. He wants to run more tests, but," she trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm scared, Ethan. I don't know what to do." Ethan watched her, his face a mask of indifference. Inside, He was seething with rage. Even now, as she faced the consequences of her actions, she couldn't bring herself to tell him the full truth. A serious illness, Ethan repeated coldly, his eyes narrowing. How could that have happened, Sophia? You've always been so careful with your health. Sophia flinched at his tone, a shiver running down her spine. Ethan, please. I know things have been strained between us lately, but I need your support right now. I'm scared. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she reached for him, as if desperate for comfort. For a moment, Ethan was tempted. He could reach out, hold her, tell her everything would be okay. The old part of him, the part that still cared for the woman he had once loved, stirred inside him. But the larger part of him, the part that had been hurt and betrayed beyond repair, held him back. Jared's words echoed in his mind, keep the illness under wraps until the divorce is finalized. Ethan's resolve hardened. You should have thought about that before you made your choices, Sophia, he said, his voice ice cold. I hope, for the kid's sake, that it's nothing too serious. Sophia's face crumpled in silent sobs as he turned on his heel and walked away from her. The sound of her sobbing, the soft thud of her body collapsing onto the couch, it did something to him. But the satisfaction of seeing her pay for her lies and betrayal outweighed any compassion he might have once felt. In his office, Ethan opened his laptop and began composing an email to Jared Thompson. It was time to move forward with the divorce proceedings. Sophia had made her bed, and now she would lie in it alone. Ethan sat in Jared Thompson's office, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest of his chair. The divorce papers lay on the desk between them, a stark reminder of how his life had unraveled in just a few short months. He wasn't the man he used to be, the man who believed in love, in loyalty, in family. That man was gone. And now he had to make sure the woman who had shattered everything he held dear paid for what she'd done. Jared leaned forward, his sharp eyes never leaving Ethan's face. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed, Mr. Rivers? He asked, his voice cool and calculating. Once we file these papers, there's no going back. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. His fingers tightened on the edge of the desk. I'm sure. Sophia made her choice. Now it's time for her to face the consequences. Jared's lips curled into a small, predatory smile. Very well. With the evidence we've gathered, I'm confident we can achieve everything you want. You're asking for full custody, the house, most of the assets. Sophia won't know what hit her. As Ethan reached for the pen to sign the papers, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. Are you really ready to destroy the mother of your children? But then, the image of Sophia with Cameron flashed in his mind, the passion, the lies, the betrayal. His resolve hardened. This was not about love. This was about justice. Let's do this, Ethan said, his voice cold and unfeeling as he signed his name with a flourish. Jared gathered the papers, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Excellent. I'll file these first thing in the morning. Prepare yourself, Mr. Rivers. Things are about to get very interesting. As Ethan left the office, he felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him, relief, anxiety, and a grim satisfaction. The wheels were in motion now. There was no turning back. When Ethan arrived home, he found Sophia waiting for him in the living room. She looked pale, drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Where have you been? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. She was clutching her coat in front of her, as if it could shield her from whatever storm she was about to face. Ethan hung up his coat, not meeting her gaze. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't ready to show her any vulnerability. Sophia stood up, wringing her hands nervously. Ethan, please. We need to talk. I got the test results back from the doctor. For a moment, Ethan's mask of indifference slipped. Despite everything that had happened, a part of him still cared about Sophia's well-being. He asked, his voice softer than he intended, What did the doctor say? Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes. It's not good, Ethan, she choked out. The doctor says I have syphilis, a particularly aggressive strain. He wants to start treatment right away. She trailed off, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs as she collapsed back into the couch. Ethan stood frozen, watching her. Conflict raged inside him. Part of him wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay. But the larger part, the part that had been hurt and betrayed, held him back. This was the consequence of her actions. He was done feeling sorry for her. Instead of reaching out, he turned and walked toward the door. I hope you get better, he said, his voice distant, colder than ice. But that's not my concern anymore, I see, Ethan said, his voice carefully neutral. And how exactly did you contract syphilis? Sophia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and guilt. She opened her mouth, but then closed it again, unsure of how to answer. I don't know, she stammered. Maybe it was from a public restroom, or, don't. Ethan's voice cut through the air like ice. Don't you dare lie to me again. I know about Cameron. I know about all of it. The color drained from Sophia's face, her breath catching in her throat. You know. Ethan laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that scraped the walls of the room. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? The late nights, the business trips, the way you've been pulling away from me and the kids. I'm not an idiot, Sophia. Sophia sank back onto the couch, her body trembling. Her sobs came in ragged bursts as she crumpled under the weight of the truth, the enormity of everything that had been exposed. Ethan, I'm so sorry, she sobbed, her voice barely audible. I never meant for any of this to happen. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. Please, can we work this out? For the kids. Ethan's jaw clenched, a surge of anger welling up inside him at her words. The kids. Now she cared about the kids. Where was that concern when she was out risking their future with Cameron? When she was tearing their family apart for an affair that had already cost him so much? Where was your concern when you were risking our children's future by being with Cameron? He demanded, his voice cold and unforgiving. You made a mistake, Sophia. People don't make mistakes like this. This is betrayal. Sophia's eyes welled with fresh tears. I made a mistake. People make mistakes, Ethan. Can't you forgive me? Ethan's gaze hardened, his heart like stone. Forgive you, he repeated, his voice etched with incredulity. For throwing away our marriage. For endangering my health and our children's future. He shook his head slowly. No. Sophia, I can't forgive that. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope, sliding it across the coffee table to her. These are divorce papers. I've already signed them. You should read them carefully. Sophia's eyes widened in shock as she looked down at the envelope, her hands trembling as she picked it up. Divorce, she whispered, her voice breaking. Ethan, no. Please. We can work this out. I'll do anything. Go to counseling, whatever you want. Just, please. It's too late for that, Ethan said flatly, his gaze unflinching. You made your choice when you decided to be with Cameron. Now you have to live with the consequences. He turned to leave the room, but as he reached the door, Sophia's voice rang out, desperate. Ethan, wait, she cried, her voice ragged. What about my illness? I need help. I need support. I can't go through this alone. Ethan paused, his hand on the doorknob, but he didn't turn around. The weight of her words hung in the air like an accusation, but he wasn't moved. Not anymore. You should have thought about that before you brought a potentially fatal STD into our home, he said coldly. Get help from Cameron. I'm done with that. He walked away, the sound of her sobbing fading behind him. He climbed the stairs to check on the kids, feeling a strange, almost detached relief. It was done. The final step in severing the last ties to the woman who had once been his everything. Now, he could focus on protecting his children and rebuilding their lives. The weight of the burden he had carried for so long, of love, betrayal, and anger, had finally been lifted. The divorce proceedings moved forward quickly. With Ethan's evidence, combined with Jared Thompson's ruthless tactics, Sophia was left reeling. Her attempts to fight back were weak at best. She hired her own lawyer, but it was clear from the outset that she was on the losing side. Her affair with Cameron, coupled with the corporate fraud they had been involved in, left her exposed on all fronts. One afternoon, as Ethan was reviewing some documents in his home office, his phone buzzed with an unexpected call. The name on the screen made his stomach tighten, Olivia Shaw. "Mr. Rivers." Olivia's voice came through, tight with tension. "I think we need to talk." Ethan's pulse quickened. He had expected this call. It had been only a matter of time. "Mrs. Shaw. What can I do for you?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Olivia spoke again, her voice was barely controlled. I received some videos of my husband with your wife." Ethan closed his eyes, a mix of guilt and dark satisfaction washing over him. He had sent those videos, anonymously, of course, to Olivia, knowing they would be the final blow to both families. The truth, he had realized, was the only thing left to give them. "I see," he said carefully, keeping his voice neutral. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, Mrs. Shaw." Olivia let out a bitter laugh. "Are you? Because from what I understand, you've known about this for quite some time." Ethan sighed, a sense of weariness settling over him. "You're right. I did know. And I'm truly sorry for not coming to you sooner. But I was dealing with my own pain." He paused, the weight of everything still heavy on him. "I understand," Olivia said, her voice softening slightly. I don't know what to do now. Cameron is begging me not to leave him, saying it was a mistake. But how can I ever trust him again?" Ethan felt a brief, fleeting empathy for Olivia. She was an innocent victim, just like him. She had trusted her husband, and now she had been left with nothing but the shards of that trust. "I can't tell you what to do, Mrs. Shaw," Ethan said, his voice steady but hard. "But I can tell you this, you deserve better than a man who would betray you like this." There was a long silence before Olivia spoke again, her voice softer. "You're right. Thank you, Mr. Rivers. And I'm sorry for what my husband and your wife have put you through." The call ended, and as Ethan set the phone down, he leaned back in his chair. He had set all of this in motion, and now the fallout was spreading beyond just his family. But as the dust settled, he couldn't bring himself to feel guilty. Cameron and Sophia made their choices. Now they had to face the consequences. The next day, Ethan's phone rang again. This time, it was a frantic call from Sophia. "Ethan, what the hell did you do?" she screamed as soon as he picked up the phone. Ethan held the phone away from his ear, wincing at her volume. "What are you talking about, Sophia? Don't play dumb with me," she shrieked. "Olivia knows about me and Cameron. She's suing him for divorce and demanding everything. And now Cameron, he's offering to testify against me in our divorce case." Ethan felt a cold, satisfied sense of inevitability settle in his chest. "Is that so? Well, it seems like your actions are finally catching up with you," he said, his voice sharp. "Sophia, how could you do this to me? How could you do this to our family?" "I'm sick, Ethan," she cried, her voice breaking. "I need help. Not this destruction of everything I've worked for." "You did this to yourself," Ethan replied, his voice cold as stone. "You made your choices, Sophia. Now you have to live with them." As he hung up the phone, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sick, grim satisfaction. Part of him still cared for Sophia, still worried about her health. But the larger part, the part that had been so deeply betrayed, felt only relief. The house of cards she had built was finally tumbling down. Over the next few weeks, the divorce proceedings accelerated. Cameron, now completely turning on Sophia, offered damning testimony about their affair, about the corporate fraud they had both been involved in. Sophia's position in the case crumbled rapidly, leaving her with nothing. In a last-ditch, desperate attempt to salvage anything, Sophia showed up at the house one evening. Ethan opened the door to find her standing there, haggard, disheveled, her eyes wild with desperation. "Please, Ethan," she begged, her voice hoarse. "Can we talk? Just give me a chance to explain." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let her in. As they moved to the kitchen, Sophia sank into a chair, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "I've lost everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My job, my reputation. Cameron has turned against me completely. And now with this illness. Ethan, I don't know what to do. I need help," Sophia pleaded, her voice breaking as she sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking. Ethan leaned against the counter, his eyes watching her carefully, but his expression was a mix of pity and lingering anger. He had heard her apologies, her desperate pleas for help, but something inside him had hardened irreparably. "What do you want from me, Sophia?" he asked, his voice flat. "You threw away our marriage. You endangered our family. What did you think would happen?" Tears streamed down Sophia's face as she let out a choked sob. "I know. I messed up. I know I hurt you. And I'm so sorry. But please, Ethan, for the sake of what we once had, for our children, can't you find it in your heart to forgive me? To help me?" For a brief moment, Ethan felt the tug of a familiar compassion. The woman in front of him, the woman he had loved, the one who had once been his partner, was a mere shadow of herself. He saw her vulnerability, her desperate need for redemption, and part of him wanted to comfort her. "But I can't," he reminded himself. He remembered the lies, the betrayal, the broken promises, and the gut-wrenching realization that she had never truly cared enough to protect what they had. His expression hardened, the walls around his heart reinforcing their grip. "You dug your own grave, Sophia," he said, his voice cold and firm. "I'm sorry you're sick. And I hope you get the treatment you need. But I can't be the one to help you. Not anymore." Sophia's face crumpled at his words. "Ethan, please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I have nowhere else to go. You should have thought about that before you decided to throw away everything we built together," Ethan replied, each word laced with bitterness. "I think it's time for you to leave." He walked her to the door without a second glance, his heart cold, but also somehow empty. As he opened the door and motioned for her to leave, Sophia turned to him one last time. "What about the kids?" she asked, her voice breaking with a mix of hope and desperation. "Will you at least let me see them?" Ethan paused, the conflict clear on his face. His heart twisted at the thought of his children's pain, but the memories of her betrayal flooded him again. After a long moment, he spoke. "We'll work out a visitation schedule through our lawyers. But for now, I think it's best if you stay away," he said, his voice heavy. With that, he closed the door behind her, the finality of it echoing in his ears. He leaned against the door for a long moment, his chest tight. The mix of emotions that washed over him, relief, sadness, anger, was almost overwhelming. But through it all, there was something else that crept in too: peace. In the weeks that followed, the divorce was finalized. True to Jared's ruthless approach, Ethan was awarded full custody of Lily and Leo, the house, and most of their shared assets. Sophia, whose health continued to deteriorate rapidly, was left with nothing but her illness and the consequences of her actions. Ethan threw himself into rebuilding his life. He took a leave of absence from work to focus on his children, helping them adjust to the new reality. It was a delicate balance. There were tears, tantrums, and difficult questions, but slowly, day by day, they began to heal. One evening, as Ethan was tucking Lily into bed, she looked up at him with wide, serious eyes. "Daddy," she asked quietly, "is Mommy ever coming home?" Ethan's heart clenched. He sat on the edge of her bed, smoothing her hair back from her forehead, his gaze softening as he fought back the lump in his throat. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "Mommy made some choices. That means she can't live with us anymore. But she still loves you very much." Lily's lower lip trembled, and her voice wavered. "But why didn't she love us enough to stay?" Ethan's chest tightened at the question. How do you explain adult betrayal to a child? How do you explain a kind of decisions that rip families apart? He searched for the right words, his own heart heavy. "Sometimes, Lily, adults make mistakes," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Big mistakes that hurt the people they love. It doesn't mean they don't love you. It just means they have to face the consequences of their actions." Lily nodded, her expression still troubled, though she seemed to accept his explanation. She sniffled and wiped her eyes. "Will we ever see her again?" Ethan sighed. The truth was complicated, and he wasn't sure how to say it without giving his daughter false hope. "Yes, you'll see her. We're working out a schedule now. But for now, I need you to be brave and patient. Can you do that for me?" Lily nodded solemnly. "I can be brave, Daddy. I promise." As Ethan turned off the light and closed Lily's door behind him, he felt a wave of emotion. His children were the innocent victims in all of this, and yet, through it all, they were the ones showing strength. The thought of their resilience gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He vowed, more fiercely than ever, to protect them and give them the stable, loving home they deserved. Months passed, and Ethan continued to focus on rebuilding his life. He threw himself into his work, earning a promotion that allowed him to provide an even better life for his children. He began dating again, cautiously at first, always putting Lily and Leo's well-being first. It wasn't easy, there were still moments of doubt, and his heart still carried the scars of Sophia's betrayal, but he had learned to move forward. Sophia's health, though still precarious, improved slightly with treatment. The doctors had warned her that she would never fully recover, but she had become determined to survive, if only to maintain some semblance of connection with her children. She had visitation with Lily and Leo, supervised at first, then gradually less restricted as she proved she could be responsible. Ethan kept a watchful eye on the process, but he allowed his children to make their own decisions about their mother. He couldn't shield them from everything, but he could make sure they had the support they needed. One evening, as Ethan sat on the back porch watching Lily and Leo play in the yard, the sun dipping below the horizon, he reflected on the journey of the past year, the betrayal, the anger, the pain. It had all shaped him, changed him in ways he was still discovering. But as he watched his children laugh and play, as the warmth of their joy filled the air, Ethan felt a quiet peace settle over him. They had survived the storm. They were healing, slowly but surely. And though the scars of Sophia's betrayal would never fully fade, he had found a way to move forward. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt ready to face it. For his children. For himself. And as the sun set on another day, Ethan Rivers looked to the horizon with a sense of hope and determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: he would face them, and he would do it for his children.